So I'd like to introduce this event's presenter, Dr. Robert M. Jacobson. Dr. Jacobson is a primary care pediatrician at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He is also the medical director of the immunization programs for both adults and children for the primary care practices in Rochester, as well as in Southeast Minnesota Mayo Clinic Health System. He is also the medical director for the Population Health Sciences program at Mayo Clinic and conducts research investigating how to improve vaccine coverage. He teaches the principles and practices of pediatric research, as well as evidence-based medicine to pediatricians in training. He lectures widely on topics concerning vaccines. Dr. Jacobson, thank you for being willing to share your knowledge with us, and please take it from here.
Thank you so much for having me. I am just going to open up my screen and hopefully everyone can see then the PowerPoint title, Patient Confidence in the COVID-19 Vaccines, How Healthcare Personnel Can Address Vaccine Hesitancy. We've noticed over the years practice gaps with regards to how healthcare providers address vaccines. When it comes to vaccination, healthcare personnel often give weak or no recommendations. They often resort to providing printed material or links regarding vaccine education rather than actually continuing to recommend the vaccine in the office or patient setting. And they often leave vaccine hesitancy unarticulated and unaddressed. So I have a number of learning objectives for us over the hour. Upon completion of this presentation, it's my hope that you would be able to articulate a strong recommendation for a vaccine, particularly the COVID-19 vaccine, convince yourself to drop the pamphlet approach to vaccine hesitancy, and instead demonstrate the 4 steps to take with vaccine hesitancy or hesitation when you face it in the clinic setting. Now, just as a way of introducing the topic, long before there was this pandemic, we've been struggling with patient vaccine hesitancy, and we particularly struggle with it with parents of our patients. In a recent survey of Wisconsin parents who had signed up to exempt their children from various vaccines for school attendance, in this study, parents gave reasons for why they refused their child's vaccines. 57% were concerned that the vaccines might cause harm. 38% thought it was better to get natural disease rather than to get immunity from the vaccine. 37% did not perceive their children to be at risk for the disease that was being vaccinated against. 31% were concerned that the vaccines might cause autism. 30% were concerned about mercury or thimerosal in the vaccines. 29% felt the disease was not dangerous enough to be vaccinated against. 16% felt the vaccine may not work. 13% felt they had ethical or moral issues against the vaccine. 10% cited fetal tissue in the vaccines. 10% cited distrust of the government, and 1% cited concerns that a vaccination was contrary to the religious belief. Now, that same survey also looked at parents who were not refusing or exempting their children from vaccines. Among this survey of parents who actually vaccinated their children, 15% of them felt it was better to get immunity by getting sick. 23% felt their children get more vaccines than are good for them. 34% felt immunity could be weakened by too many vaccines. And 34% of them felt unvaccinated children ought to be allowed in school. So it's not just vaccine hesitancy among those who are refusing the vaccines. There's a certain percentage of parents, certain percentage of the public who have hesitancy even as they go about getting the vaccines. We have to deal with all of this vaccine hesitancy. And we're going to experience real vaccine hesitancy with the COVID-19 vaccine, just as we do with other vaccines. The rates for the US for COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy have been reported to be high. In April of 2020, long before we had any vaccines against COVID-19, surveys were showing that about 26% of the American public were planning to refuse a vaccine against COVID-19. Over the months of 2020, that actually increased. And by December 2020, 44% of the public said they were unlikely to get a vaccine against COVID-19. The rates are worse among young adults and less educated adults. 49% plan to refuse among those who are 18 to 49 years of age as compared to their elders. And 52% of those with a high school education or less were planning to refuse the vaccine as compared to those with more education. Now, across the vaccines, and just the same with COVID-19, we see about 5 general categories of vaccine hesitancy. One is the vaccine won't work. 2, let's see. 2, the vaccine isn't safe. 3, the vaccine isn't needed. 4, the alternatives are just as good or better. 5, the authorities are rejected. And if we think about these 5 categories, almost every time we hear of a patient or parent expressing a concern about a vaccine, it falls into one of these categories. Now, to put those 5 categories into place, I want to reflect with you how vaccines join the routine vaccine schedule. An independent science-based authority determines their effectiveness, their safety, their need, the lack of alternatives, really hitting on each one of the 5 categories of vaccine hesitancy. This independent authority is the U.S. Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. It's actually separate from the Food and Drug Administration. It's separate from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It's a group of public health scientists, infectious disease scientists, and a layperson who meet regularly throughout the year looking at the evidence for vaccines. They're committed to being evidence-based. That is, they're committed to depending on science for their decisions as to whether to vaccinate or not and with what. They utilize the licensure data from the US Food and Drug Administration, and they utilize epidemiologic data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Again, this U.S. Advisory Committee is comprised of 15 members who are independent from the FDA or CDC, and they're dedicated to providing the only federal source of recommendations for adults and children for both routine and risk-based use vaccines for adult and child civilians. They provide a standardized use schedule, dosing, timing. They even specify the contraindications and precautions for all the vaccines you and I use. I had mentioned that this independent authority looks at 4 features of each vaccine in terms of whether or not it should be recommended. And the first is whether the vaccine is effective. By blinding both the people doing the research and the subjects participating in the research, we control over and overcome coincidences and prove cause-effect relationships in terms of whether the vaccine actually prevents illness or not. Licensure requires randomized controlled double-blinded trials. And these trials are done with using only consistent batches of vaccine that show lot-to-lot consistency. And they're tested with all the constituents to be used when licensed so that as we go through the testing, we're not using something that we won't otherwise be using in practice. And the vaccines are tested at the age when their vaccines are going to be due against a placebo. And they're tested with all the other vaccines already due at that age. They're shown to be effective in preventing disease and not just making antibodies against the disease. And then they get licensed by the US Food and Drug Administration. The next category is safety. These same randomized controlled trials Also test for acceptability of the reactivity to the vaccine, and also provide testing for persisting problems, disease, or injury from the vaccines. They test for interference with other vaccines. And these vaccines then are monitored after by the Food and Drug Administration's licensure. They're monitored by the FDA and CDC and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices for um, all the while making sure that it's the same lot-to-lot consistency with an unchanged manufacturing process, assuring that lot-to-lot consistency. There are mandated safety surveillance systems put in place to continue to monitor for safety signals from the vaccine when widely used. These include the VAERS program, or the Vaccine Adverse Effects Reporting System, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, and Phase 4 testing. Now, another category is whether or not the vaccine's needed. This isn't demonstrated by those randomized controlled trials. It's demonstrated instead by other studies that look epidemiologically as to who is getting the disease and when, and how a vaccine might play a role. So it's not just that the vaccine is proven to be safe and effective, but it must be graded as necessary. The U.S. Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices does this separately. It's an independent body of experts, and they work with 4 national medical academies to make sure that they concur. The American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Family Physicians, among those 4 academies. Not all FDA licensed vaccines get recommended for use. That's important to know. While we do have vaccines that are safe and effective, if they're not needed, they aren't recommended. And then when they're no longer necessary, the ACIP will remove its recommendation. So we have had, over the course of the ACIP's work, vaccines that are put into retirement and no longer recommended, doses that are removed and felt unnecessary. Now, the last category is the complaint that vaccines uh, uh, may have good alternatives. The ACIP requires that the vaccines to be recommended lack good alternatives. The FDA demands competing vaccines work just as well as other vaccines. Um, we have combinations used in other countries that aren't approved in our country because they fail to work as well as our individual vaccines. Uh, they're not licensed in the US given the lack of equivalence. Let's see here. Bear with me. For example, the ACIP requires vaccinations meet or exceed current alternatives. We have a vaccine license in this country against tuberculosis. It's called the BCG vaccine, but it's not routinely recommended because we have alternatives to control tuberculosis. It's not recommended given successful non-vaccine control. We have a vaccine, Prevnar, PCV13, a vaccine that was previously recommended for all those 65 years and older, but it's no longer recommended for those 65 years and older as an infant PCV13 greatly reduces the risk. I want you to take a look at this evidence table. It's an important one um, because it compares the recommended vaccines as shown in the second column to prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, and vitamins, minerals, and nutritional supplements. We demand evidence of effectiveness for vaccines and prescription drugs, but not so frequently and not so assuredly for over-the-counter drugs, and never for vitamins, minerals, or nutritional supplements. We demand safety data for the vaccines and for prescription drugs, but not for all over-the-counter drugs, and never for vitamins, minerals, or nutritional supplements. We demand that the vaccines be needed, unlike demands for prescription drugs where there is no epidemiologic evidence proving that an additional brand name or additional variation of a prescription drug is needed. And we don't do the same, we don't have the same requirement for over-the-counter drugs, vitamins, minerals, or nutritional supplements. And we demand that the vaccines lack alternatives, but we don't make that demand of prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, vitamins, minerals, or nutritional supplements. Now, the COVID-19 vaccines that we have, all three currently authorized vaccines, underwent these randomized placebo-controlled trials that I spoke of earlier, proving efficacy and safety. They were studied in tens of thousands of patients for efficacy and safety and shown to be highly effective in protecting against severe disease and death. They were also shown to be safe and well tolerated. No requirements were bypassed or minimized. The process was sped through with improved communication, more frequent communication between company and regulatory agency, but at no time did they say, we're lowering the bar for these vaccines because we need them. It was more, we will speed up the review process because we need them. All three are recommended to all adults: the Pfizer vaccine for those 16 years and older, the Moderna and Janssen vaccines for those 18 years and older. But production limits in making the vaccines have necessitated allocation rollout in phases. Now, I would say we're going to struggle with vaccine hesitancy with COVID-19 vaccines, just as we do with other vaccines. But what I'm about to recommend to you in dealing with vaccine hesitancy towards the COVID-19 vaccines applies to all the vaccines you recommend. And number one, you need to know clinicians' recommendations matter. Many studies across many vaccines and ages. Nowak et al. In 2005, Lin in 2006, Nowak again in 2007, Brewer in 2011, Gary in 2011, Rosenthal in 2011, Darden in 2013, Gargano in 2013, Tallow in 2013, and Darden and myself in 2014, along with Finney and Redden in 2018 and Liu in 2019, all showed clinicians' recommendations for vaccination increase vaccination uptake. Job number one is to make sure that our clinicians' recommendations for vaccinations are heard, and that applies to COVID-19 vaccination as well. Your first step in dealing with vaccine hesitancy is to make sure the patient understands this is what is recommended. It's not just an option. Why do our recommendations matter? And why do they matter more than the ACIP or the AAP? It's our professional standing, our intimate relationship with our patients and parents, our place as a trusted health advisor. And stronger recommendations are better. Rosenthal in 2011, in a study of 19 to 26-year-old females concerning the HPV or human papilloma virus vaccine, showed among 1,375 women who had received one dose in the last 4 months as compared to the same number who did not. Rosenthal and her colleagues basically asked those people to recommend the recommendation they got from their healthcare worker on a scale of 1 through 5 in strength for the vaccine. So she went with her colleagues, both to those who got the vaccine and those who didn't in the last 4 months, said, rate how strongly you were recommended to get this vaccine. One being did not strongly recommend the vaccine. 5, on the other end of the scale, strongly recommend the vaccine. And of course, 2, 3, and 4 in between. If a woman heard a strong recommendation for the HPV vaccine from her healthcare provider, she was 4 times as likely to get the vaccine as compared to those who rated them as weaker recommendations. But you might be asking, what recommendations are stronger? What makes a recommendation strong? Opal published in Pediatrics in 2013, a landmark study that gave us insight into how you phrase a recommendation for vaccine strongly. In this study, Opal and colleagues video recorded 111 parents of children aged 1 through 19 months of age. They oversampled vaccine hesitant parents and videotaped health maintenance visits. In these visits, 74% of the time, providers used presumptive language. Well, we have to do some shots now, rather than participatory language. What do you want to do about the shots? The odds of the parents accepting if presumptive language is used was 17.5 times more likely to get the vaccine than if participatory language was used. Take a look at this schematic. Here we ask who initiated the vaccine recommendation or plan specifically in these 111 video recorded well child visits. In Opal study, 3 of the times nobody mentioned the vaccines, no plan was verbalized. In another 15, the parent actually brought up the vaccine before the healthcare worker did. In 93 of the cases, it was the clinician, however, and we're going to investigate how that clinician phrased the recommendation and whether it resulted in vaccination or not. How did the clinician initiate the vaccine recommendation in those 93 cases? 69 times, or 74%, the clinician used presumptive language. Well, we have some vaccines due, or the nurse will be in next to give the vaccines. But in 26% or 24 of the cases, the clinician used participatory language. What do you want to do about the shots that are due? How did the parent respond to the provider's initiation? When presumptive language was used, the parent accepted 74% of the time and resisted about 26% of the time. When participatory language was used, the parent accepted 4% of the time and refused 83% of the time. What happened when the clinician met resistance or hesitation? Offered a mitigated plan in 21% of the cases, accepted the parent's resistance in 29% of the cases, and persisted in about 50% of the cases. How did the parent respond to the clinician's continued pursuit of the initial plan or recommendation? The parent accepted in 47% of the cases, continued to resist in 53%. How did the clinician respond to the continued parent resistance? Offered a mitigated plan in about 40% of the cases, accepted in about 30%, and continued pursuit of the initial plan in about 30%. Studies have been replicated with the same findings. Observational studies such as Sturm in 2017, studying 19 pediatricians. Annette Hofstetter in Vaccine 2017 reports her videotaping of 50 visits with 17 clinicians. Opal repeated his study and published in Academic Pediatrics with a cohort of 73 families. Repeatedly, presumptive language, this is what is due, this is what comes next, work better than participatory language. What are your thoughts about the vaccines? What do you want to do about the vaccines due? Dempsey similarly did a big study in 777 parents and showed the same. Then came randomized controlled trials where practices were randomized. Brewer published in 2017 a randomization of 30 clinics to either give presumptive language, participatory language, or no teaching at all. Dempsey randomized 16 clinics, and Mayo randomized 20. All found the same thing. Presumptive language worked better than participatory language. So you need to make a recommendation. You need to make it a strong recommendation, and using presumptive language works better than participatory language. Now, how do we reconcile this idea of using presumptive language? Shared decision-making has its place when more than one reasonable choice exists, when you're choosing between two statins or two approaches with type 2 diabetes, when the patient's values and concerns might differentiate among these reasonable choices. Motivational interviewing is important when the target behavior involves daily habits away from the clinic, when changing behavior calls for cultivating a daily motivation. But that's not the situation here with vaccines that we recommend, including the COVID-19 vaccines. The presumptive style is a brief statement making a reasonable assumption that the parent or patient is ready to vaccinate. Participatory style unfortunately sends the wrong message. It sends a message that the vaccine is optional, that you're offering it as a choice, that you don't feel strongly about it, that you could go either way. When a parent says, I'm not anti-vaccine, but I won't be getting the COVID-19 vaccine, or one of your adult patients says the same, or even a colleague, um, we're all too often wanting to put off that discussion. And commonly you'll hear phrases like, well, I'd like you to think about that. Let's talk about it further at our next visit. Let me give you some written information so you can read about the vaccine when you get home. But this has been shown to fail. The pamphlet approach, you should drop it. Systematic reviews show that education doesn't work to change vaccine status. Briss showed this back in 2000. Linda Few and her colleagues in 2014 repeated the review of the literature. Brendan Nyan and his colleagues actually showed that education can often backfire. He showed it with measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and autism in 2014, and then showed it again with the flu vaccine and its effectiveness in 2015. Pluviana repeated the Nyan study and found the backfire effect as well. Sometimes just providing education actually goes the wrong direction, as Pluviano and colleagues showed with measles, MMR, and autism in 2017. So what are you supposed to do when your patient, your parent, the adult in front of you indicates hesitation or resistance to your vaccine recommendation? What are the persuasive elements? What makes for an effective argument? Well, wise philosophers for centuries have pointed out that there's elements to your presentation that matter. And number one is your compassion for the patient, your understanding of their concerns, and your empathy for their situation. Making a successful argument isn't just throwing the science at them or trying to educate them, but instead connecting with your patient with compassion, understanding, and empathy. You're you're speaking, you're persuading with your standing in your role for that patient, um, as well as your knowledge of the science and your purpose with providing healthcare for your patient. These are the four elements, and not just science alone, not just knowledge alone that persuades. This has been developed in a short approach you can use in the office setting. Alison Singer, mother of an autistic child and defender of vaccines, developed the CASE approach. She uses the C for corroborate. That's where you display your compassion, understanding, and empathy. About me, that's where you point out your standing and role. The science, where you express your knowledge, and then finally, E for explain advice, where you then underline your purpose. That's the CASE approach, C-A-S-E, corroborate, about me, science, explain, advise. Now, this CASE approach is a model for talking to the vaccine hesitant. It's a mnemonic to organize a rapid, useful response that you can use in a clinic setting. It's a brief technique to put into use today. The case for CASE, Well, it does more than exchange information. You're not just attempting to educate or to give out a pamphlet or provide a link for another day. You build on shared values and beliefs you share with the patient or parent in front of you. It maintains the basis for your advice and draws on the science, but with a focus on your education, and then allows you to persist with your strong recommendation. The CASE acronym, again, C for corroborate, A for about me, S for science, and E for explain advise. Let's take corroborate first. Here you ask for and acknowledge the person's concern. You identify the underlying value that you actually share in common, and you set the tone for a respectful, successful talk. Then you move to about me. You describe what you've done to build your knowledge base to reconcile the concern with the shared value. You appeal to the reason why the person has sought your advice, your standing, your role. Then you move to S for science. You relate what the science says briefly. You confirm for the listener that you know the science. You link that to the concern and the shared value. Then you explain, advise. In terms of the shared value, and in terms of your professional standing, with you informed by the science, you provide your strong recommendation. That's the CASE approach. Corroborate, about me, science, explain, advise. Let's put it into action. We have a patient in front of us who says, I won't be getting this COVID-19 vaccine. You say, why not? What's your reason? You are making an attempt to corroborate. The patient responds, the vaccines were rushed through and only approved with an emergency use authorization and not a full licensure. We don't know yet if they really work or if they're really safe. This is your chance to corroborate. What's that shared underlying value? Here you say, I would feel the same way. I don't think you should get a vaccine that hasn't been fully proven safe or effective. I too was worried at first when I heard about the emergency use authorization. Here you've connected with the patient. You move from corroborate to about me. Now you come to me for my advice. And as your clinician committed to the health of my patients, I demand that proof before recommending vaccines, any vaccines, including those against COVID-19. Now you move to the science. You move from about me to how you got educated to the science. I found in my readings of the medical literature some very reassuring facts. The FDA did speed up its meetings and communications, but still required the vaccine manufacturers to go through the entire pre-licensure testing that the FDA requires for all of the vaccines it licenses. These vaccines were studied for effectiveness and safety in placebo-controlled, double-blinded, randomized trials involving tens of thousands of patients. That's why I'm making this strong recommendation to you, because we already have the data we need. So you went from corroborate to about me to the science, and now you're doing your explain advise. You're making this recommendation because we have that data on efficacy and safety. That's the CASE approach. Corroborate, ask what is the specific concern, identify the underlying value both of you authentically share, then about me, remind the parent or patient why they're seeing you, your role. Then you get to the science. You summarize what you learned in your role about the concern, then explain, advise. Explain your advice in terms of the concern, your role in the science. Let's do it one more time. I am definitely not getting this COVID-19 vaccine, your patient says. Why not? What's your specific concern? This is critical. You don't just accept a flat out refusal. You try to connect with your patient. What is it that bothers you about the vaccine? It can be different for each patient. I'm concerned that the COVID-19 vaccines might cause long lasting health problems. I agree. We must avoid pharmaceuticals or biologics that cause long-lasting health problems, especially when we're only using them for the prevention of health problems. There, you've connected with the patient, you've expressed your shared value. Now you move on to about me. I've learned in my studies as a doctor or nurse or immunization coordinator that vaccines must meet a much higher standard for safety than medicines used to treat diseases once the diseases occur. This is because the vaccines are given to so many more people simply to prevent illness. The FDA required that the very large trials of the COVID vaccines follow thousands and thousands of vaccine recipients closely for 2 months after each dose for safety signals. That length of time exceeds the time in which such safety concerns would have shown up. The safety studies with follow-ups and tens of thousands of vaccine recipients gives me the confidence to strongly recommend these vaccines to those eligible for them. So that's corroborate. Ask what is the specific concern, identify the underlying value you both authentically share. That's about me. Remind the patient parent why they're seeing you in your role. Then it's the science. Summarize what you've learned about in your role about the concern, and then explain advise. Explain your advice in terms of the concern, your role in the science. That's the case approach. So in summary, I want you to use the presumptive style. Assume that the patient is here for your advice and talk about what needs to be done. Use terms such as needed, what's due, rather than choice or options. Signal your strong recommendation for a routine vaccination. Drop the pamphlet approach with vaccine hesitancy. Use a case approach instead. Corroborate the concern, then remind the patient why they're here to see you and your role, and then summarize the science, and then put it all together to explain your advice in terms of the patient's concern, your shared value, your role, and the science. That's the case approach. And with that, I think we have time to take questions about what I'm recommending you do with vaccine hesitancy, particularly in terms of the COVID-19 vaccine.
Great, and thank you, Dr. Jacobson, for sharing all that information with us. You're right, we have about 15 minutes left, so we'd like to open up this space for any questions or comments from attendees. So as we mentioned at the start of this event, you can share comments or questions online through the chat or the Q&A box on your screen, or if you prefer to share out loud, you can do that by pressing the raise hand button on your computer or using *9 if you're on the phone. So we did have a few attendees submit questions during the registration process. So I'll start with those. The first one asks, what are the long-term effects of the vaccine versus the long-term effects of not receiving the vaccine and having COVID-19?
We have seen through the studies of literally tens of thousands of patients with the COVID-19 vaccine, no signals of a long-term effect on health other than creating immunity to prevent the COVID-19 infection, and clear-cut evidence that prevents symptomatic severe COVID-19 disease and death. On the other hand, we know that the COVID-19 infection can cause long-lasting problems for some of us. Sometimes you'll hear about statements of people who are called long haulers or long-time haulers who are suffering from side effects months and months, even going on a year after getting COVID-19 infection, persistent headache, persistent myalgias. And of course, we've heard about life-threatening multi-inflammatory syndromes that can occur in children with COVID-19 that can affect them for the rest of their life or in their life prematurely. So the difference between vaccine and infection is very real. One does have problems with vaccine reactions like soreness and ache and fever for a day or two that are that then resolve. The other can cause long-term harm.
Thank you for that. So another of the submitted questions that we had is, can you talk about the COVID-19 vaccine's effect on fertility?
Yes. The, people have raised this concern that the vaccine might affect fertility, but there was no evidence in the lab or animal studies, nor any signals that occurred during the licensure trials that showed that this would interfere with fertility. Um, we we actually have no vaccines that interfere with fertility, but there are a set of studies that are done at the bench and in animal studies long before they're put in humans to rule out such signals that would worry us about fertility. In fact, I think the greatest threat to fertility at this point is COVID-19 infection during pregnancy. As you may know, a pregnant individual is 5 times more likely to have severe COVID-19 infection than a non pregnant person that same age and otherwise in the same medical condition.
Thank you. And yeah, on that, we have a related question that kind of asks about what should I tell women who are pregnant or who are planning to become pregnant about getting vaccinated against COVID-19? So can you just expand a little bit to
Yes.
address that question as well?
And I'll speak to our experience here at Mayo Clinic, but it may be very similar to yours. For our healthcare workers who are pregnant, who were not able just to work from home, but needed to work in place with patients, because they were at risk for COVID-19 infection during their pregnancy, the discussions went, while we do not have direct evidence from the phase 3 licensure trials about safety in pregnant women because they were excluded from the study, we saw no safety signals to suggest there would be a problem. This is not a live vaccine, and its effect on the body is localized to the injection site and is quickly resolved as the body digests the vaccine remnants. It does not enter the bloodstream. It does not affect the rest of the body. It does not change the genetics of the patient. And so, for those pregnant people who are still at risk for COVID-19 infection because of their work, we recommend they get the vaccine. For those who are really not at risk for COVID-19 vaccine and COVID-19 infection during the pregnancy, they with their healthcare providers have a discussion, say, look, the risk is minimal of COVID-19 exposure, then they could forego vaccination. But this is rarely the case. And given what we know about COVID-19 infection causing severe complications of pregnancy, knowing what we know about the risk for COVID-19, most persons that I know who are pregnant and now are offered the vaccine because of their risk status should get the vaccine.
Thank you. So the next question that we have is, if you receive the first of a 2-shot vaccine and then you get COVID in between the 2 doses, should you still get the second shot?
Yes, but you may need to time that second dose differently. While the Pfizer dose is separated by 3 weeks, if you unfortunately acquire COVID-19 infection between doses, um, you if you are treated with a monoclonal antibody for COVID-19 illness, or if you're given convalescent plasma to treat the COVID-19 infection, you need to wait 90 days before you get the vaccine because those two treatments, one or the other or both, can interfere with the vaccine's response. Um, Otherwise, you may prefer to wait 90 days before you get that second dose after your infection because the infection itself should give good immunity to the recurrent infection for a good 90 days. After 90 days, the evidence is not as clear. Um, do you still need the vaccine? The same thing, because the immunity from the disease may not last more than 3 months, and because individuals' response to the disease is highly variable, with some making great immunity and some not making much at all, we recommend that all of our patients who have previously suffered COVID-19 infection get the vaccine, including those who get it after a first dose of the vaccine. The vaccine itself cannot cause COVID-19 infection. So for those individuals who get COVID-19 infection after the first dose, it is from an exposure to someone else.
Thank you. So another question we have for you is, can you still become infected with COVID-19 after vaccination?
Yes, the vaccine is not 100% effective. And in fact, we don't have evidence, clear-cut evidence, that it prevents asymptomatic infection. And we know that up to 40% of COVID-19 infections are asymptomatic. We know that the vaccine reduces your risk as compared to a placebo by 95%. So if your chance of getting COVID infection in the next year was 1%, by getting vaccinated, you've now reduced that risk to 0.05%. It's very effective in reducing that risk, but it's not 100%. Doesn't make your risk zero for symptomatic disease. And we don't know what it does for asymptomatic. It's possible you could still get infected and not know it and then give it to someone else.
Thank you. And so then building off of that response that you have, if there's a vaccinated person who contracts COVID-19, does the vaccine prevent the long-term or long-haul symptoms that some people get from getting COVID-19?
It certainly appears to do so. Those phase 3 trials look for symptomatic disease in those who got COVID-19 infection and those after being exposed to the vaccines or placebo, and showed a dramatic reduction in symptoms and in severity, including persistent symptoms. So one way to prevent the long time hauler syndrome is getting the vaccination.
Thank you. And then this person's asking, how should I address vaccine hesitancy if the patient does not trust the government or pharmaceutical companies?
It's a real problem. And one way is to speak to your situation as a healthcare worker and what you did and what you're recommending. Frankly, one of the most important things you bring to your healthcare visit and to your patient is that personal connection. When you can look your patient in the eye and said, look, I have issues with our government as well. I have issues with the pharmaceutical companies as well. But given that an independent body reviewed the data and relied on science to review that data and not just what the company said, this is what I've done for me. This is what I'm recommending to my family members. This is why I got the vaccine. That speaks volumes to your patients. So your personal situation and how you overcame that distrust will speak volumes to your patient.
Great, thank you for that. And then I think we have time for maybe just one more question. So this one is asking, how hard should I push a patient who seems really close to making a decision, or someone who's kind of going back and forth about whether or not to get vaccinated against COVID?
I think you have to read the situation individually as to where you are in the visit and the comfort level. Is the person still willing to discuss, or is the person wanting to shut down? I, in the end, I want my patients to get the vaccine because they are convinced it's what I recommended and it's the right thing for them. I don't expect them to become a junior scientist, nurse, or doctor, but I do want them to know that the person they trust with their healthcare is making that strong recommendation. If it looks like the person doesn't want to discuss it any further that visit, I then say, all right, but I want you to know what my strong recommendation is, and I'm here for you. If you change your mind this afternoon or tomorrow, let's get back in touch. I don't want to I don't want to ruin that relationship with my patient. I don't want to kick that patient out of my office. I want to continue that conversation. And many of my patients and their parents who have refused vaccines have changed their minds thinking about what I said and putting in context with what I've done and their own situation, and coming back and changing their mind. So you have to keep your fingers on the pulse of the conversation as well as on the patient to see where you are, and never to be cruel or offensive. You're helping your patient. You're not wanting to browbeat them. It's more of a matter of communicating and connecting with your patient rather than chastising and punishing them. Your words should be a help to them and not a hurt.
Great. And with that, we will close our Q&A session. So Dr. Jacobson, thank you for taking the time to provide this valuable information for us. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we close?
Just that your recommendation is your most important tool for getting your patients vaccinated. So, what you say you recommend, and even saying the words out loud, I strongly recommend, matters more than anything else you can do. Don't rely on pamphlets or the links. Instead, connect with your patient, refer them to your standing, summarize the science, and explain your strong recommendation in terms of their concern, the underlying value, and what you know.
Great. And thank you again, Dr. Jacobson, for taking the time to present. And thank you to everyone who attended this event and for the hard work that you do. With permission from Dr. Jacobson, we will be sending out a recording of this presentation that you can view or share with others who would benefit from it. The email with that recording will also have a link to a 7-question survey, so please take about 3 minutes to complete that. We'll be using the feedback you provide to better serve you and your community. Finally, if there are any questions about this presentation, please use the contact information on this slide to contact myself, Julie Nystrom, or one of my coworkers. So with that, thank you again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.